You didn't know you were doing it. You just knew that when you heard your father's car pull up in the driveway, something deep inside you changed. You learned to read the sounds, the way the car door closed, the pace of his footsteps, whether the keys hit the counter hard or softly. You were only 7 years old, but you were already an expert in threat assessment. You didn't call it that, but that's the reality of what it was. And that little boy is still paying attention 40 years later in every room he enters. Hello, I'm Bill, and this is the Warrior Medic. In the first 4 episodes of this series, we named the wounds. We named anger, authority, isolation, and approval, and we traced them to the father wound. We talked about what they cost. Today, we're going to go somewhere we haven't gone yet. Today, we go to the origin of those wounds. Not what the wound does to you as an adult, but how it got in. What happened to that young boy? What he concluded? And how that conclusion, drawn at age 7 or 10 or even 14, became the operating system that is still running your life today. This is the most specific episode we've done, and it's intentional because vague wounds stay vague. Named wounds can be healed. Every wound follows the same pathway, 3 steps. And once you see the pathway, you recognize it in your own life immediately. Step 1, something happened, an event, a pattern, an environment, something that a boy experienced repeatedly or intensely enough that it left a mark. And then step 2, that boy drew a conclusion. Not a conscious decision, a survival conclusion. His young mind, trying to make sense of what was happening, landed on an explanation. And that explanation shaped everything that followed. And then step 3, the conclusion became a strategy, a way of moving through the world that protected the boy from further damage. And that strategy, it worked. Then, the problem is, the strategy is still running in a grown man's body in situations that have nothing to do with what originally produced it. The wound is not the event. The wound is the conclusion the boy drew from that event and the strategy he built around it. With that framework in place, let's go to each of the 4 wounds and trace them to their source. The first wound, and the one most men don't connect correctly, is the rage wound. Most men who carry the rage wound assume they got it directly, that they were raised by a rageful father and simply became rageful. And that's partially true, but the research tells a more accurate story. A rageful father doesn't primarily instill rage in his son. He instills fear. Now think about what it's actually like to grow up in a home where the atmosphere is controlled by a man's anger. You learn to read the room before you ever enter it. You develop what I call threat assessment skills, scanning for signs of danger before you commit to being present. The way he holds his shoulders, or whether he makes eye contact, the volume of the television, or the tone of his first word. You learn all of this without being taught, because your nervous system, designed for survival, figures it out. And you live in a state of low-grade, constant fear. Now here's the critical piece. Fear needs somewhere to go. In a healthy home, a boy can express his fear. He can be anxious and have that anxiety relieved. He can be afraid and be told he's safe. But in a home controlled by fear, fear has no safe outlet. You can't show fear to a man who interprets it as weakness. You can't be vulnerable with someone who uses vulnerability against you. So the fear goes underground, and over time, it transforms. Every difficult feeling, grief, anxiety, shame, helplessness, it all gets compressed and funneled into one emotion that was permitted in that home: rage. The boy who was afraid now becomes a man who's angry, not because he chose anger, but because fear with no outlet eventually has to go somewhere, and the only model he had was his father's. What the boy concluded: the world is not safe. The only protection is ferocity. What a man carries: a switch that fires before he can stop it. At the boss who questions him, and the wife who reaches out to him at the wrong moment. At the child who spills something, or at the driver who cuts him off. The trigger is always present because the nervous system that learned threat assessment at age 7 is still scanning, is still protecting, still converting fear into the only response it knows. I lived with this anger, and I'm here to tell you, as a boy and later as a young man, whenever I came close to tears, I was immediately consumed by anger. It was an irrational, undefined anger that would lead me to see everything in extremes, and no one around me was safe from me. The second wound, the absent father, is one that most men dismiss because that doesn't seem as damaging as the rageful one. He didn't hit you. He didn't rage at you. He just wasn't there. Maybe he worked constantly. Maybe he left. Maybe he was physically present, but emotionally so far away that you might as well have been talking to a wall. And maybe he came to some things, but never the things that matter to you most. And here's what a boy does with a father's absence. He doesn't conclude, my father is a limited man who couldn't show up. That's an adult conclusion. A child doesn't have the developmental capability for that type of complexity. A boy concludes something much more personal. I'm not worth staying for. Read that again because that's the operating system. Not he wasn't absent, but I wasn't enough to make him stay. I wasn't worth his time, and I didn't matter enough. And that conclusion, installed in the boy before the words to name it arrived, drives everything that follows. It drives the achievement, because if he can produce enough, accomplish enough, or become enough, maybe someone will finally see he's worth staying for. It drives the approval seeking, because every boss or every mentor, every authority figure becomes a substitute for the father who didn't stay. And every piece of recognition is a small answer to a question that was never supposed to be his to answer. It drives the fear of abandonment, the thing underneath the isolation. He doesn't push people away because he doesn't care. He pushes them away before they can even leave, because leaving is what people do, and he learned that early. The absent father's wound is the quietest wound and the deepest, because the boy who concluded he wasn't worth staying for grew into a man who's been trying to prove otherwise ever since. And no amount of achievement, approval, or success has ever quieted that conclusion. Because the conclusion wasn't about his performance, it was about his worth. And worth is not something you earn, it's something you receive from a father who stays. And the third wound is the controlling father. It's the one that shows up most clearly in the workplace and in your marriage. The controlling father takes many forms: the man who dictates every decision, what the boy wears, what he eats, what he does with his time, what he's even allowed to feel. The father who overrides the boy's voice so consistently that the boy stops using it. The father who micromanages with criticism, or who uses punishment, physical or emotional, to maintain dominance. In every version, the message is the same. What you want doesn't matter. Your voice doesn't count. I'm the power and I decide. And that boy, who has no power to change the situation, draws a conclusion and makes a decision. The conclusion? Authority is dangerous. The man with power over you will use it against you. And the decision? Never again. I will never let anyone have that kind of power over me again. That decision, made in childhood, was an act of survival. It was the boy protecting what little he had left, his internal life, his sense of self, the one thing the controlling father couldn't reach. But the grown man carries that decision into every situation that involves authority. His managers give him direction, and something automatically reacts. Not anger necessarily, but resistance, the refusal to be told. And his wife, she makes a request, and the walls go up. Not because the request is unreasonable, but because it activates the old conclusion. Someone is trying to control you, and your decision, never again. His faith asks him to surrender, and he can't go there because surrender is what the controlling father demanded, and he swore he would never surrender again. The authority wound doesn't just cost him his career, it cost him his marriage, and for many men, it cost them their relationship with God. Because the God he imagines, if he imagines one at all, looks exactly like the controlling father, demanding, watching for failure, ready to punish. We'll come back to that later in depth because it may be the most important wound this series talks about. And now the fourth wound. The fourth wound is the emotionally unavailable father. This is the most common one because this father doesn't look like he's causing damage. He's there. He provides, he shows up at the important events. He's not cruel. He's not absent. He's just unreachable. Try to connect, and you find nothing. Not hostility, just emptiness. A kind of blankness where emotional presence is supposed to be. Maybe he talks about sports, but never about anything real. Maybe he gives advice, but he never actually listens. Maybe he's physically in the room, but mentally, he's somewhere you can't find him. But the boy tries. He tries to reach his father. He brings him things, his drawings, his questions, fears, and his excitement. He wants his father to see inside of him. And the father, not out of malice, but out of his own woundedness, simply can't go there. The boy reaches and he finds a wall. And from that, he draws a conclusion. Closeness leads nowhere. There's nothing on the other side of reaching. So he stops reaching. He builds his own walls, not to hurt anyone, but because reaching hurts more than not reaching. And that wall, built to protect a boy from a father who couldn't connect, follows him into every relationship he will ever have. His wife reaches for him, finds the same wall his father had. Not because he's like his father, but because he learned from his father that this is what men are like on the inside. His children reach for him, and he deflects, not because he doesn't love them, but because nobody ever showed him how to be reached. The emotionally unavailable father's wound is the one most men carry the longest without naming, primarily because it doesn't look like abuse. It doesn't feel like violence. It just feels like being alone. And being alone when you're surrounded by people who love you is one of the most disorienting things a man can carry. 4 fathers, 4 wounds. 4 conclusions drawn by 4 boys, each one trying to make sense of what's happening to him. Here's what I need you to hear before I let you go. The conclusions made by these boys were not wrong. Given what they knew at the time, they were survival strategies, reasonable responses to unreasonable situations. The problem is, they were made by a boy, and now they're running a man. A conclusion drawn at age 7 about your worth, about safety, about authority, about closeness is not truth. It's a wound, and a wound that can be named can be healed. So here's your one thing for this week. Which one of those 4 fathers did you recognize? Not necessarily in the extreme version, maybe a quieter version, or even a combination. And what conclusions did that boy draw? Not what happened to him. What did he conclude about himself, about the world, and about what he had to do to survive? So sit with that for a while. Write it down if you need to, because naming the conclusion is the first step towards no longer being run by it. Every weekday, I'll be releasing a short video diving deeper into these wounds. Watch and move towards healing. If today hit something specific in you, my book, Forged by Fire, is in the notes below. It's the full account of my own installation and the path forward towards healing. The link is below. Hit subscribe and like this video. Share it with a man who needs to name where his wound came from. You might be changing his life. Remember, we're all becoming warrior medics. Reach back, help someone on their journey. My name is Bill, and this is the Warrior Medic. No man left behind.